there's an art in war, then Hitler failed as an artist. You can connect Archduke Franz Ferdinand to hentai. Who would win in a fight? 300 war elephants or the Alps? You could have buried it, cremated it, thrown it away, or done anything else, but you literally decided to eat your eyeball. My hometown had the first McDonald's drive-thru. Now that's history. Imagine that you are walking through a forest. It's dark and foggy. You don't hear any noises except for the faint cawing of a bird in the distance, the rustling of the trees in the wind. But as you walk down the path, you begin to hear whispers from the trees. And as you try to take out any other noises, any other distractions, you listen closely as you hear the trees say, "Auf Wiedersehen." "Oh, you're in troubles now. Dirty Romans." That may be how you felt if you were a Roman walking through the Teutoburg Forest, which is the subject of this episode of Not Your Daddy's History. I have a very interesting guest this episode, Jeff King. He's a very funny comedian from the Baltimore, D.C. area. I've been watching him do stand-up for a couple years now. He's very funny, but I didn't know until I got him on the show that he was actually a very big fan of history. So this episode is actually going to be very different from the original one, because our first guest didn't really have too much knowledge of the history that we were studying. But when I told Jeff King what we would be doing, he went like full school mode. He was doing research, watching documentaries, taking notes, like he was prepared. So this episode is going to be different, because basically what we're going to have now is just two history nerds nerding out. We have a lot of tangents, which I'm going to go ahead and apologize for. I'm terrible with tangents when it comes to talking about history. I can be talking about the Gettysburg Address and then somehow end up at the bombing of Hiroshima, which always inevitably leads to hentai. So, that's how tangents are. When you're a history nerd, you connect the dots, and the dots take you wherever the hell they want to go. If you guys want to comment on if you enjoy having a guest that has little less knowledge or a guest that has more knowledge, whether just hit me up on our Facebook, on our YouTube, leave a comment anywhere there, and I'll read your responses, and then I'll let Jeff know that, sorry, man, you're too smart for this podcast. You're too smart for me, my listeners. But the subject of this, as I said before, is the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. If you guys are fans of Roman history, I think you'll have a lot of fun with this one. We cover a bunch of Roman history. We cover the background of the event, the battle itself, and the aftermath it had for not only Rome, but the Germans themselves. And remember, this is not your daddy's history. Oh, Steve Tracy is such a beautiful person.
Ever since I started reading about Teutoburg Forest, I've wanted to kind of get more background about the history. I understand the basics of Roman history, of course.
Yeah.
Like the fact that you don't really know how it was founding because the dirty Gauls burned down the archives in like 371 or something.
Yeah.
No, I think it was actually, I forget when. I feel bad. I feel like I need to know the dates, but
that's a funny thing because in the community of history, fans and people that study it, I think there was almost like there's an understanding from a lot of people that are like, you don't have to worry about the dates, it's like if you know the events and you can piece them together in a general timeline, you don't really have to know the exact
you don't know the exact
time.
dates. It's good to know, but it's good. I mean, it helps for understanding. Like for me, it helps to know that all this stuff has happened. A lot of the major events, especially what we're going to talk about, all happened in like a 50-year period. Like this battle was like 50 years after the assassination of Julius Caesar. something like that.
Something like that.
And only
Probably not even
9 years
50.
after
Yeah.
the death of Christ. So it's like
Yeah.
people that were alive during this era of Roman history must have been like the millennials of that period. Like I
Yeah.
can't believe how much shit we've had to live through.
It,
And we
yeah.
don't really think of it that way.
And
History's so condensed from our perspective.
yeah, that's one of my favorite things to look at is the kind of stuff that people would live through in a time period. I
Mm-hmm.
was watching the show Hatfields and McCoys on History Channel, and you would have a guy like at the end of the show, they had an explanation of how long somebody lived, like when they died. So you would have someone born in like 1840 and then live and die in like 1920.
Right.
So I was like, dude, imagine this guy lived through the Civil War,
Mm-hmm.
probably like this, like maybe a war with Spain or Mexico or something,
Yeah.
and then
really young
then World War I, and then into like the Roaring '20s. So you had a guy that was living with candles and slaughtering his own cows for food into the age of like jazz.
I mean, I think about that.
That's insane to think about the life.
And to think about the lives that you overlap with, like your parents or grandparents. Like my grandmother was born in 1924 and passed away in 2015. But she went from like growing up, being born just before the Great Depression to sort of kind of knowing how to work a smartphone. Like,
well, it is just like the internet,
But when you go into ancient history, you don't think about how like you imagine these events as kind of spaced out, yet not.
Yeah.
So to think like there were, I was reading up on Varus, the imperial officer, or excuse me, Roman officer and politician that really fucked up in the Teutoburg Forest. He's been transferred because he fucked up so bad in Jude. Can I say fuck in this? I'm guessing we can.
Yeah.
He was so incompetent at running the Judean province that he got transferred to the Rhine. Which I mean, it's a large bureaucracy.
Yeah.
You do that, people get moved around a lot.
Yeah, and well, and I was telling Steve before this podcast, I had watched the show on Netflix, Barbarians.
Yeah.
And the problem that I had was I watched that show and I liked it, and I took a lot of that stuff in. But then I watched another video that was like a review of it, and while the person was like, "There's a lot of good things about that show," they're like, "Obviously, a lot of it is not accurate." And I thought about it, I was like, "Oh shit, that's not accurate. It was a fucking like dramatized show." So I quickly I rewatched like 5 different YouTube documentaries to try to take out the false information and put in the new one, because I was like, don't say dumb shit that doesn't it's not real.
Oh yeah. And also like in when you're watching a historical thing, I'd heard this concept. It's like you can evaluate for, among other things, accuracy and authenticity.
Yeah.
It's like nothing's going to be accurate, but it can be authentic and vice versa. Like you can get the facts. I mean, like we're saying, you can get facts right, but still miss the point.
Yeah.
And
one of my favorites,
really good, the History of Rome podcast on Spotify, which is, it's like 175 episodes. Yeah. And I'm pretty early on, but like he was talking about in the episode about the phalanx battle formation, how when he was studying ancient history, that was a lot of the curriculum, because your average Roman citizen, military service was such a big deal. Like the Roman Empire was geared towards war fighting, and they did it better than anyone. So it's like, if you're not going to study the hoplite battle formations and the tactics and the military, you're missing the point. A really good quote that came out of this podcast was, Romans didn't spend a lot of time with their heads in the clouds. They spent their time with feet in the mud. Rome is known for its military campaigns. That's
and during that time, and what was the case in a lot of ancient people, was that a military person, that was a class of people.
It was.
Right? It's not like today where it's a job. It's a thing you do, It's like today, it's like if you want college and benefits, you go join the military. Well, in Rome, they were people that were farmers that wanted to be a soldier. And sometimes they couldn't, because they'd be like, no, we're not going to take a farmer. It's like, you be a farmer, and then we have soldiers,
classes. Like the richest guys would be in the cavalry.
Exactly.
because they could afford horses.
Mm.
And then if you were rich, probably, you could be, I think, because plebeians could own a lot of land. They just weren't top tier level Roman citizens. But a lot of plebeians, they would be in infantry units or in the centuries.
Yeah.
But they'd be expected to provide their own weapons and equipment.
Yeah.
So it was based on social class, what type of soldier you would wind up.
Yeah. Well, let's
Yeah.
I guess let's start talking about the background of it. Because I think when talking about the Teutoburg Forest, I think with something in particular like this, it's good to talk about how it begins.
Yeah.
Because of the effect that it has, like afterwards, is so changing that it's like you have to know where it started and then how it happened and stuff.
I mean, to use a parallel to American history, it was in a lot of ways like the 1968 Tet Offensive of the Roman Empire. It was it was not just a tactical defeat, but a symbolic one.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
I mean, after which, it was the limit of advance for Roman military expansion up north. I don't think they never really sent anybody across the Rhine again. Maybe.
No, they never expanded up to that point. They had gone like over it, but they had never like set up shop basically. Like they had never gotten there and been like, all right, we're here to stay. But this was during the time of Augustus, and he's such a fascinating guy because he is arguably the best emperor they have. Like almost immediately after him, they just have a slew of shit fucking emperors.
Tiberius was his son, right? And then
Tiberius was his adopted son because he had a son or two, and then they died, and so he adopted Tiberius. And I know Tiberius eventually would become, while he was a very good general, he would become a mad emperor. And he had like a KGB style group of people that watched over senators and got information on them and stuff. And then he killed Caligula's family.
Right.
And then made Caligula emperor. And then you have Caligula, one of the worst emperors.
Right.
One of top two bad emperors that they have.
And Caligula, I assume.
Yeah. And then they have Claudius in between, and then Nero again. So Augustus is like the best that they have.
Sure.
He defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra.
I mean, he brought in that Republican. He still had a Republican statesman background, I think, right? Somewhat. Or at least
somewhat. He was actually like kind of getting groomed by Julius Caesar before
he was his nephew.
Yeah, he was like his nephew, and then Caesar was like trying to groom him and like send him on some military campaigns to get a little bit of experience with that. But he also taught him in politics and stuff. And when Caesar died, then he made Augustus his heir. I mean, there's a month of July for Julius, and then Augustus was like, well, guess what? Put my name on that bitch too.
Right.
Give me August.
Right.
I'm so happy too, because I think July and August are like really good. I'm so happy there's not like a Claude Vember or something. Like they really, I wonder if other
Nero, that'd be an appropriate figure for December.
Oh yeah, for sure. Cold, murderous,
indifferent.
Makes you play the fiddle by the fire, But yeah, Augustus just fucking was like the best. He united a civil war. He won a civil war, united the empire. He took a bunch of places, like he took over the rest of Gaul and that was Africa and shit.
Julius Caesar's big campaign too, right? I mean, he
was. Oh yeah. I was listening
was
to the Hardcore History, Dan Carlin's podcast on that one. That's an insane one because you don't realize how many people Julius Caesar killed until you actually look at the numbers. He actually murdered like possibly 2 million Gauls over like the 10 or 20 years that he was.
Even even into the Middle Ages, there would be brutal fights between the Italians and the French, like the Albigensian Crusade, which is where the whole Carcosa mythology comes from.
Yeah,
I think there were a couple of million casualties, and that was just the Catholic Church saying we have regional challenges to our power. yeah, this isn't gonna in southern France, no
Yeah.
way. So they slaughtered that. It was a whole Christian sect that they had
Mhm.
exterminated.
Well, and it's fascinating too because he even said on it that if you look at the numbers, because the numbers of people killed were even presented by Julius Caesar himself, and
Mhm.
even if he's bringing the number down to make himself maybe look better, which he even explained he wouldn't do,
No, yeah.
because Julius Caesar's writing in his own way of how much people he defeated, so he would crank the number up. So he's like, even if you take his number and bring it down a little bit to say maybe he's exaggerating, it's still an extremely large amount of people to murder.
Mhm. Right.
So it's like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, I never.
Like staggering, yeah.
Oh, but yeah. So the fact that this, I think that's what is one of the more fascinating things with the Teutoburg Forest is that you have this emperor that is essentially like the Ronald Reagan or I don't know, Teddy Roosevelt of Roman emperors. Like you have the one who's just presented as like the best one. I guess the
Right.
George Washington, I guess, would be
That's typically more
the better one.
Cincinnatus because he was an early hero of the Republic.
Yeah.
There's a lot. Well, and during the American Revolution, Cincinnati, like that's what they called him. They called him the
Mhm.
American. They called George Washington the American Cincinnatus because he was known as the citizen soldier statesman. Just
Yeah.
really, just the absolute figure of manhood at that time.
But yeah, you
But
have
yeah,
this.
I would say it's probably more like a modern, like an FDR, even like
Yeah.
someone who created the modern state as we know it in a lot of
Mhm.
ways, or at least at that time they would have.
But to have this like this big failure, this huge failure
Right. Well,
under
that
him, it was
was
like it's like this one. It's like you have all of these. Look at all these grand things I've done, and then it's like, what's that? What's that X over there? And we're like,
you
it's
know what? He's Lyndon B. Johnson. That's who he would be. That was his not as we were saying, it's his Vietnam. Like no matter how much great society legislation he passed, you're always gonna get remembered for that.
yeah.
And that's and even now, I mean, it's such a big part of Germany's national identity,
Hmm.
especially in the 20th century,
Yeah.
because of course, and I'm sure you're going to explain this a lot better than I will, but Arminius was the Germanic folk hero that unified the tribes against Rome,
Hmm.
and
Yeah, that was something I didn't actually know, and I found it fascinating because I was reading about how in the 19th century, when Germany started getting like a nationalism, a rise of
yeah,
nationalism in its country, they found the story of Arminius and they made a big statue to him,
yeah,
and it was supposed to be where they at the time thought the battle took place.
right. It's like Lower
So
Saxony, right?
it was like right near like a town was built there, so it's like right like in the center or near it somewhere. But they started presenting him as the guy that liberated and freed Germany. But then obviously after World War II, and Germany
Right.
was like, we need to reel back this whole nationalism thing because it seems like we can't do it right. They started omitting him from their textbooks and kind of bringing it down. And even on like the 200th anniversary in 200, the 2000th anniversary in 2009,
Right.
they originally planned to have a big celebration about it, and they stopped it because they were like, we don't want people getting behind it, because he did become
Well,
a
when the Germans
German
get
nationalism symbol.
right. Also, it's like every war in European history is the Germans' fault in some way. Even the Napoleonic Wars, like especially that, because that Napoleon was the first leader to really create a modern map of Europe.
Hmm.
And after 1815, all the European leaders that defeated Napoleon deliberately said, "We're going back to the city-states that we have in
Yeah.
Italy and Germany because fuck Napoleon." Which
Actually, on Napoleon, I found out that the reason Britain drives on the other side of the road is because Napoleon made the rule to drive on the right side of the road. And every time he took over a country, he changed it to the right side of the road. So countries that he either didn't conquer or said "fuck no, fuck you, Napoleon," changed it.
that
So
is
that's
all.
why there are some roads in Europe that do the right and some that do the left.
Wow.
Yeah.
That goes deep. And those Europe and I mean that speaks to European culture because
Hmm.
they remember they have thousands of years of history to be angry about.
Yeah.
Like like those soccer matches or football matches, as they would call them, like there's a lot of national beef in them. Like
Oh yeah.
it's not just about the teams. It's like, yeah, you burned our city down in 1637 and we're still mad about it. Like really mad.
Yeah. I think the only thing that's like that in America, I mean, America has some of that with states, but like,
Right.
I
I mean, it's
think
getting
it's
more that
Michigan
way.
and Ohio.
Right.
Like two of their colleges are like always butting
Oh, well,
rivals.
that's a fun story because my wife went to Ohio State. And this is the time of the year where we don't talk about that school up north by name or even use the letter M in some cases. Like those.
How was dinner? It was very.
Yeah.
It was good.
Let's just say Ann Arbor may be called a lady of ill repute.
I actually didn't know much about Ferris because the one thing I was thinking of is the thing that I find fascinating about Germany taking out this portion of history, and at least Arminius and a lot of their stuff, is I remember hearing about this all the time in history. I would hear about it in history class. I would hear about like even in passing. It would just be like, oh, the Roman Empire did this, Augustus did that, they lost 3 legions in the forest. Right. And then it would move on to like the split between the two. And then I took a Latin class for 3 years in high school, and I learned about it there. So I remember hearing about it all the time. So to find out that in Germany they cut it back, I was like, that's fascinating.
Right.
I'm like, usually it's the other way around, where we omit stuff that Europeans know, and this is like the one time where it's like, no,
Germans, I get why they know what happens when they get a little too feisty, you know, and it doesn't really turn out good for them.
Yeah, they're trying to do brush fire.
I'm glad now they've become like Nazis about democracy, though.
Yeah,
like they're fascist in how seriously they take being liberal.
Yeah. It's like what America always wished they could do to other countries.
Yeah, exactly.
They would just like beat them up and then put capitalism in them, and they're like, we love it now. This is amazing.
Yeah, we completely Clockwork Oranged that entire country into never starting a war again, basically. Not to say they don't want to, they're just fucking afraid to.
Yeah, you know at like the UN meetings when countries start doing stuff and they're like, Germany, do you have anything to say? They say it with their teeth closed. You're like, nope, not at all.
One of my favorite Margaret Thatcher quotes was, I think it was in the 80s, and Germany had defeated England in the World Cup. And somebody asked Margaret Thatcher, how do you feel about the Germans defeating, you and your national sport? And she says, we defeated them twice in this century at their national sport.
Roasted. I love it.
Oh man, like we were saying earlier. I'm sure she was thinking about she wasn't just thinking about World War I and World War II. She was going back. Like they know about this stuff. They remember the wars of German unification. Bismarck was a big proponent of the Arminius myth because when Germany was unifying in the late 1860s and early 1870s, you needed national folk heroes like that.
Oh yeah, and and to go on Varus, because we talked about him. I didn't know much about him, and it was interesting to learn about him in his history with, like you said, Judea and Syria, where he wasn't a general. He was a lawyer, an administrator. That Augustus, he was like somewhat related to Augustus. I tried to follow the family line. I couldn't. I got lost.
Right.
Those things where like he married into the royal family, so he wasn't blood related. But back then, they just took that shit really.
I mean, as long as you were a patrician, you could do that, right?
Exactly, and that's what it was. He was a patrician, married into the royal family, and then he just got a job basically, and he wasn't a good general, but he kept getting pit with another general that was really good. So he would go hang out with Germanicus.
Right.
And then they'd go to Syria and Germanicus would kick ass. And then he'd sit there in Syria and tax the shit out of the people. Mm-hmm. And then if they mouthed up too much, he'd crucify the shit out of them.
Right. Oh yeah.
And then they go to Judea, put down the Jews, and if they mouth up too much, boom, crucify the shit out of them.
So he had the muscle behind him.
Exactly. Like he's like when you play Civilization and you have the great general and the great guy like next to each other. and you don't take them away from each other. You keep them right next to one another. That's basically what it was. Because as soon as, right, because that's what's fascinating, is as soon as like Tiberius and Germanicus leave him in Germania, that's when he fucks it up. You're just like, I'll keep you right here and you'll be fine. And then, oh, here comes Arminius's unit to take him over.
It's like, was it the Peter Principle or something?
I don't know what that is.
I don't know it either. It's some bureaucratic idea where like you're going to rise to a certain level that you're going to be good at, but if you go beyond it, you're probably not going to do very well. I really wish I'd understood this better before I tried to.
I've heard of that before. I can't remember the
you see it a lot in the military and government. Like,
oh, for sure.
You get a lot, and like say an officer would be good at commanding like a battalion-sized element, which isn't that it's big, but it's not a full regiment. Mm-hmm. So it's like, yeah, this guy can command some troops, but you give him more responsibility. He's going to try to take that attitude that was successful at a lower position and do the same thing, but at a higher position. It's not going to work as well.
Yeah.
It's not the same responsibility anymore. Not totally the same, but I feel like it applies. Yeah.
Another thing I was thinking about studying all this Teutoburg stuff was that it's funny to me how people will say they don't understand history. They don't like, I don't like watching, I don't like thinking of dates. I don't like reading about history. I find it boring. And then they watch Game of Thrones.
Right.
And they love it. Because studying this whole story, I was thinking you could do an amazing Game of Thrones style show about this whole thing. Easy. And you could split it in like 3 or 4 seasons and it would be amazing. Like, because there is so much, the Arminius was taken at a young age to go live in Rome as a hostage.
Right.
And they have no idea when he began to think about betraying Rome. So you could write a story of him going to Rome and as a child thinking about betraying Rome, but then becoming a Roman citizen, learning Latin, going through their military, becoming an equestrian, becoming a knight, doing all this kind of stuff, and still with the idea of him doing it.
I mean, there could also be this idea of because I was just watching Snowden, the Oliver Stone biopic, which, and it starts out, Edward Snowden he's a true believer in not just the principles of the United States, but in the government too, and like this idea that secrecy is for in the interest of national security. And then the more he does it, I get the feeling. It's hard to speculate on someone who's been dead for 2,000 years, but a guy like Arminius, he probably was very fervent in believing in what he was taught. And then when there's a disconnect between what you've been taught and the reality of what you're expected to do, people have a lot of issues. And this is so far off topic. Obviously, we're going to go to this, but when soldiers were coming back from Vietnam, and there wasn't a clinical diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot of psychologists theorized, like, you're sending these clean-cut boys who are from any town USA growing up in, with these wholesome 50s and 60s mid-century American values.
Yeah. And
then sending them into this really primitive environment in the most horrible conditions and exposed to the deadliest and most traumatic situations. Their identities were destroyed, essentially. Like, there was this concept that it was around in the 70s of the counterfeit universe. Like, this idea you were taught about God and loyalty and decency, and then you go to this country and you see how things really are. Like, that change really affected a lot of people.
And going even further into this Vietnam side by side with this story is you have these soldiers, growing up, like you said, in the 50s with these American values of pride, patriotism in your country, all this kind of stuff, going to Vietnam, living through that hell, and then coming home and then having people, spit on you and call you names and stuff. Right. And just like and Arminius went through the exact same thing, because when he returned back to his tribe, there were people of his own family that just wanted to murder him because they were like, fuck, you're Roman. You're not real tribe. You're Roman. So he goes to Rome. He isn't a full Roman. he goes back to his tribe. So you have this interesting, once again, another aspect you could put in like a film type thing is this
Right.
thing of like, who does he side with?
Right.
Which
I
is
mean,
what you had in the show Barbarian. That was the kind of
sure.
thing they played with was he was a Roman, he was an honorable
This
Roman, but
happens
even
a lot.
Romans looked at him and said, you barbarian piece of shit, get out of
I
here.
think it's a common theme in literature and fiction because it does happen a lot where
Yeah,
someone has to go away. I mean, it's the idea of like a soldier or something, or anyone who goes away and then returns home, and the familiarity of home or what
yeah.
it's no longer what they recognize.
Mhm.
And it's not that maybe it's changed, but also the person's changed. And like you feel that separation.
Mhm.
And I'm sure Arminius, when he, and there's not a lot known about his early life, right?
Mhm.
I mean, other than he studied in Rome.
That was about it. I actually tried to look it up because in
Right.
the show Barbarians, they portrayed him as like like as Varus as a surrogate father.
Mhm.
But historically, there's nothing to suggest that. But that being said, there is nothing that says who he lived with, just that he lived in a noble home.
Right.
Because he was the prince of a chieftain, so he was considered nobility. So he got to live with a patrician, but didn't say who or
He was Germanic
how
nobility
high up.
before he went to Rome.
Yeah, he was the son of a chieftain. Because that's what they do is they take the son of a chieftain and then they go, "Why would you attack us? We have your child."
Right,
And
exactly.
all of them were like, "Yeah, you're right." So
right. They
best leave
understood
that
how
alone.
yeah, much like America, they believed more in subjugation than like full on extermination.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you can't tax the dead.
Right.
That's essentially what it was.
And as he was in Syria and Judea, Varus really tried to run these villages and nations with an iron fist. Like he levied
Mhm.
unfair taxes, would torture village elders, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and he'd piss off a populace with taxes, and then when they came up and said, "Hey, you're taxing us too much," he'd be like, "Are you talking back to the emperor?" And
Right, and
just
like he would,
crucify him.
but also, and I got to look this up real quick because there were a lot more legions in Germania, but they were pulled to the Balkans.
Yeah, there
In
was this
80.
thing called the
Mhm.
Illyrian Revolt,
Yes.
is what it was, and that was actually Arminius actually served in the revolt, and that was actually another point that
It was
some
the
history.
Bellum Batonanum.
Ooh, breaking out that Latin. But that was possibly, some historians think, one of the other turning points for Arminius into betraying Rome, because he could have gone to the Balkans and seen these people that he kind of saw as like his tribe, like
right.
just like smaller groups of people. And then when Rome conquered the Balkans again, they slaughtered the people that revolted, and then essentially just tried to destroy their culture and be like, "Hey, we tried to play easy with you, but since you want to revolt, now we're
Right.
just going to control you completely."
Mm-hmm.
And so seeing that could have pushed him to be like, "I don't want that to happen to my tribe. So I'm going to go back and get them to revolt." So that's
Right.
another
And
and
there's not also a lot on how he unified the tribes, is there?
that is true. There's not a lot, and that's another thing that when I was thinking of like
Because
a
not
Game of
everybody's
Thrones style thing of him.
there were still like your loyalists to the empire, or in Germany. There were some not all tribes, but a lot did. A lot of
Oh, for sure, yeah. There was either tribes that were loyal to Rome or ones that were just like,
neutral.
yeah, I just don't want to piss them off.
Right.
Like they understood, like, I don't want to fight Rome. They're going to come back and murder us eventually. So no. But no, yeah, there's no historical records as to how he brought these people together, and that's the kind of stuff about ancient history that I like, that I
Mm-hmm.
think annoys other people, because when they study ancient history, they go, "Man, I wish we knew more details." But I like that parts of history you can kind of create your own fanfic.
Right. Yeah, a
Like you
lot of
can just write, like, like I could think if I wanted to, maybe Arminius jerked them all off, and maybe
right.
he was just so good at it. Like, he's talking to the Sweeby tribe, and they're like, "We're not going to fight Rome, no way." And then he just yanks his pants down and jerks his dick like really hard.
Right.
He just comes. It comes. So he puts out a campfire, and he goes, "Oh fuck, dude, I will join you to hell and back." Oh my god, that was amazing.
Sounds pretty German, actually. You know? All that repression, they must blow huge loads. So that's why, like, when they cut loose, they scheisse it up.
Brothers, join me. I'll let you shit on my chest and pee on me. That's where it started. The German fetish porn started with Arminius.
They're so anal retentive until they're not. Until they're dumping it on each other's chests. It's all right to stereotype the Krauts. They deserve it.
Yeah.
What are you going to do about it? Fight us?
The battle itself, too, there was I meant to send you this one documentary series. It's a YouTube channel called Kings and Generals.
Mm-hmm.
And they specifically do military history.
I found a good video on the battle where it actually gives you the troop movements and gives you the terrain pretty well, like terrain.
Yeah, that's what they do. And actually, I'm going to see if
that's
I
what's
can
interesting, because the way Varus moved the legions through really was, I mean, tactically, he really screwed those 3 legions.
Yeah.
And for context, I guess we should probably explain how big a legion was. Approximately 5,000 men. Right?
Yeah, it was about 5,000 men, and I with the 3 and then with the 3 legions he had 3 legions, and then he had other.
He had like supporting arms, like cavalry.
Exactly, you'd call them auxiliaries. So he had auxiliaries that were like smaller forces. So I'm sharing on this thing, and for those Kings and Generals, great YouTube channel, check them out. They do really good reenactments of stuff. But this is essentially kind of what each video does: is they have little blocks of soldiers. So you have this picture of a wooded area, and then the area too in the forest too. Not only was it forested, but it was boggy. It was muddy.
It was like a big swamp, and it was between 2 hills, right? So he was taking this. God, it's like when I'm on the NCR trail between 2 big hills, I get nervous, and I don't have like 15,000 men I'm responsible for, 1,500 men. Yeah, that's some complacency, but like, it seems like a natural. It would make sense if you're thinking at all tactically. Don't go between the high ground through impossible to traverse swamp. Yeah, but I don't know.
Well, and
there were a lot of ways. And Caesar was known for being very cautious with troop movements. Like Caesar wouldn't move his army until he was absolutely sure that it was not only safe, but he was able to maximize it somehow.
Yeah,
right? Maximize tactical advantage, or lethality, or what have you. Whereas as far as he didn't send and in this video it kind of broke down common Roman military tactics for crossing a danger area. Like if you absolutely have to cross the bog, you might send out like an advanced scout party to see what's on the other side, or to go around into the hills and see what kind of defenses would be up there. But they did none of it. They just plowed right through, in the name of speed, right?
Yeah. Well, and Varus, when I think about Varus and like how the battle kind of like the precipice to it right before it started, I almost think of like a Mel Brooks type character, where you literally you have Arminius Lord Varus, I know a very good back road to get to this group of Germans that are uprising up in the north, and you just see like a dark, foggy, muddy, red eyes, like blinking and everything. And then you have like his legate going like, "Sir, I think we should probably go like maybe another way." And he's just like, "Nope, please, I trust this Arminius. We'll go in that deep, dark, deadly, gonna die forest."
Yeah, or you could have it like it's an Always Sunny in Philadelphia cold open where Varus says, "There's no way I'm losing 3 legions to the barbarians." Then it'd be like Varus loses 3 legions to the barbarians.
That episode where you lose 3 legions.
And it was brutal too. It was a brutal fight and aftermath. You didn't get taken prisoners by the barbarians.
Yeah, and one of the things that studying history always disappoints me is when it's presented in certain medias. Sometimes you'll see the same trope or stereotype in it. And I play the Total War games on the PC, and one of the games, the Rome 2, you get to actually play the Teutoburg Forest. It's really fucked up though. They make you play as the Romans.
That sucks.
And the point is like, hey, try to survive this. And I'm like, but I don't.
But nobody survived.
But I don't, though.
Pretty sure they were all killed, right?
In the beginning of that battle, not all of them were killed. And actually, I have an interesting story I found about that. But in the beginning of the battle on Total War, they take these giant balls of like hay or like grass, and they set them on fire, and then they throw them at the Romans. So you have your guys, and you have to either try to get them out of the way or set them up in a shield formation to try to brace for it. And then in the show Barbarians, they light like a path of like oil, fire, some kind of flammable thing, and it basically splits the legions up on with fire.
Right.
So I was like, dude, that sounds like a really cool tactic. And then I found out that that's not true. That's just something that got thrown into like the myth of the battle, that they somehow used fire as a way to throw out, mess up the Romans. And that they didn't do that. They're like, no, they just threw javelins and rocks at them.
Yeah, basically they just.
And I was like, damn, dude, that fire attack is awesome.
Right.
I was like, I'm so disappointed that wasn't like a real thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's like anything else. They got to Hollywood it up for TV.
Well, and because kind of going back to that one thing about Romans, with their own level of, gosh, what's the word I'm thinking of? Like their media, is that they would throw stuff like that in, where they would be like, oh, the only reason the Germans were able to defeat the legions was they used a dragon. They had an avatar on their side, and that's why they wouldn't have beat them if they didn't have the avatar.
I mean, ambushes were considered very like bush league by the Roman military. They believed in the phalanx fighting on open ground.
Yeah.
So they actually I think after the initial ambush, they pushed out into a field to kind of try to draw them in, draw the Germans out.
Yeah.
But they didn't really take the bait.
No. Well, yeah, they tried to set up camp. Because that's another thing, too, is the battle took place over 3 days.
Right.
Technically 3 days. Whereas a lot of times it's shown it's like a quick, like maybe the battle took an hour or two. And it's like, nah, the Romans fought for longer than that. But yeah, they would basically ambush them every time they weren't in camp. So they would be in camp, and then they try to go through the forest, and they get ambushed. And then they're like, oh, fuck. And then they go back, make another camp, try to escape.
That was how Robert E. Lee, I'm sure he studied it too when he was fighting the Wilderness Campaign. Like it was back then, using Napoleonic tactics.
Yeah.
Very bush league to fight behind a tree in the 1860s. Yeah. And Lee understood that the Union Army they had to move through these like dense backwoods of Virginia. So Lee actually divided his army and would attack them as they were trying to pass through.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's effective because when you try to catch an army on the move back then, you could they didn't have time to set up a phalanx. They didn't have time to set up battle formations. So you really, if you have a good ambush set up and a good fighting position, that's going to really be an advantage.
And then the aftermath of the battle that always also spurred my imagination was 6 years after the battle, they sent another series of legions in to go get the dead. And they, like the stories of going into a forest and seeing bodies nailed to trees.
Right. Well, they tortured all they executed and crucified the officers, like the junior officers and centurions.
Yeah.
But the senior ranking ones were burned alive in a really grisly human sacrifice.
Yeah.
And the altars are still there when Germanicus went up in 2014, 2014.
1418. Yeah, he kept looking. He never stopped. He just lived 2,000 years and kept looking. Yeah, well, and that's that kind of stuff always, like the macabre, dark stuff in history, that stuff always interested me too. Seeing, going through and saying, because then I could think of that version of the battle being like a horror movie, because especially if you look at pictures of German forests when it's a foggy day,
very eerie.
Dude, they're terrifying.
I mean,
they're scary as shit. So imagine like coming up on a forest just filled with carcasses, and even though it had been 6 years, they were still able to tell things had happened to these bodies. Like they knew their hands had gotten cut off, and when their eyes had gotten gouged, what is it? Plunged out, whatever, gouged out. Like, damn, like, oh, like the stuff that happened to these people. And one of the fascinating stories that I found out was because you asked if there was any survivors. So yeah, so they murdered all the officers,
Right.
and then they either they murdered a lot of the soldiers, but any of them that they captured, which was I think I heard probably only like a couple hundred of that,
Mm-hmm.
they would enslave, right?
Right. Oh, that was common practice.
Yeah. And I read a story that in AD 50 AD, some Roman general, whichever one, was doing an exploratory march through Germania, and he attacked this tribe. And when he scattered them and they left, they started plundering them, and they came up on this group of Roman like prisoners. And some of these guys were people from Varus's legions that had been captured by these guys for 40 years.
Jeez.
So they liberated, it didn't say how many, but it said that they liberated some people from Varus's legions 40 years after it had happened. I'm like, that's crazy. That is insane. Like, oh my,
USSR.
that
That
is
for 20 years.
And that is once again going back to that Vietnam thing. That's finding a soldier that was captured for 10 years of the Vietnam War,
right? Of course,
and getting him out again. Like, oh, and you know that those guys had to go back and people asked them stories.
Oh yeah, legendary. Like everyone knew in Rome about what happened up there.
Because there would be so few of them, if and that was probably like I'm sure there were some people that were like, I was part of Varus's legions.
I'm sure
I made it
out.
A
lot of stolen valor from the wars of like I'm sure like
stolen valor.
You weren't in the Punic Wars. You didn't fight.
That would be so funny. Some guy comes into a brothel with like dirty Roman armor, and some other guy comes up and says, Legate, how are you? And he's like, yes, Legate. And he goes, oh yeah, I know that's not Legate armor, you idiot. Like,
I don't think that you'd have the balls to do that in Rome, because like I'm sure impersonating a soldier, that was death. No way.
They probably just put you in the army. They probably just go, all right, well, you have your armor, so here you go. And just put you in formation.
I wonder if there were a bunch of libertarians back then. They were like, oh, my Appian way. I mean, it had to be. I mean, like any society, you have the same groups of people that always there's going to be your tryhards who are really motivated. There's going to be people who don't give a shit and just kind of go along. There's going to be criminals.
Oh yeah.
We're all growing up together.
Yep.
Well, that's why it is interesting to study history, and that's why I found it. It's like I always thought, I feel like we all think I was born in the wrong time. I don't actually think that. I like being alive now. I can learn about other times, but I don't have to live through them. Like I can learn about the ancient Romans on my laptop in my house that's heated without having to shit in the street unless I want to. It's very nice.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah. People don't. When I began studying history, that was like the one thing that I really took to heart was the historical context. And I remember I didn't actually think about much of this until I took a college course on it. Is that really understanding the historical context of when something occurred is so important. Because it really puts you in their shoes, and it stops you from saying shit like that. You stop saying, I wish I was in the Viking Age. No, you don't. Because you'd probably historically be...
You'd still be you.
Yeah, exactly. You'd be you, and you would be captured and raped by another Viking village.
Exactly. It's actually better to be you now.
Yeah, and if you weren't sacrificed to some pagan god, then you were enslaved, and then sacrificed later when you got too old. Like, they weren't good.
Or even if you
weren't good times.
They're like, I wish I lived in the 70s. It's like, you wouldn't be doing blow, playing guitar, and getting laid. You'd still be in your house being a sad sack piece of shit.
One of the most important things about looking into historical context that I learned was during the Dark Ages, right? Or like what people, what's considered the Dark Ages. The turn of the Dark Age from the Dark Ages to the Renaissance occurred when the people like the thinkers of that time began taking back Greek ideas, right?
Yes.
Because they basically, the church said, we don't want to listen to anybody that's a pagan, anyone that was polytheistic. They're like, that's all anti-God, anti-Christian.
Right.
And we don't want to study any of that. And then once people started thinking, fuck that, I want to go back and listen to it, and look at what they said,
Right.
that's when you have this mixture of new and old ideas.
Yes.
And there's one guy in particular, I can't remember his name right now. I used to have it somewhere. Because it was some kind of weird. Here it is, Francesco Petrarca. But he was kind of the first one to put this idea of like taking an understanding of the past and looking at it through the eyes of those in the past. He basically looked at people in the church and was like, why would you judge Socrates and Aristotle for not believing in Jesus when they lived before Jesus was born?
Right. They were, I mean, think about what they were. They were judged for being pretentious assholes, but in their own time and according to the social context of that time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Socrates was executed for being so obnoxious, right?
Oh, dude, I'm going to do it.
He's the ultimate stand-up. He's the ultimate, like, if
yeah.
he never wrote, he really didn't do shit, but he talked ungodly amounts of it.
I'm gonna do an episode of Socrates because he became one of my favorite.
He's
Greek
a troll,
philosophers.
man.
He's so good.
An absolute troll. He was the Red Bar Radio of ancient Athens.
One of my favorite stories of how he would piss people off is he would pretend he didn't know anything about the subject, and then come back and immediately say everything he knew about it. So he was like talking to a general, and the general was talking about how he would. Like his tactics. I'd send my men out and they have to fight hand in hand and do all this stuff. And he would basically start like dumb question number one and be like, so as a general, what do you do? It's like, I lead my troops and I lead them in the battle and I inspire this. He goes, and like, what kind of formations do you do? And he'd go into this and that. And then he would present a question and then immediately follow up because he was a soldier. So he knew all this fucking information.
Right.
So he would just come right back and basically just flabbergast the general, who was like, and I'm like, Socrates, modern day, he's an asshole. He's an absolute asshole.
I mean, there's a little bit of him in every Facebook troll.
Oh, for sure. A gaslighting asshole troll.
Sea-lioning the shit out of people. That's where you ask people obnoxious questions you basically know the answer to make them look stupid. It's also called being a lawyer.
Which he could do.
Oh yeah, I'm sure he would have been the Johnny Cochran if he had the motivation to go to law school, which he did not.
But that was always like when I first heard that train of thinking when it comes to studying history and understanding that you have groups of people that lived in completely different, social hierarchies and social structures, and things didn't matter to them,
right. Now, I mean, you're starting to see kind of a reverse of that, where people are saying that it's a sign of great privilege to try to examine things in their own historical context. And I understand you need to look, you're always going to have to look at things through a 21st century lens. You can't not have that bias because it's where you live. It's what you know. But studying history means you have to do as much as you can to consciously take yourself out of that.
Exactly.
And then you bring it back to that, and then you examine it through that. All right, we know what they did now is fucked up, but this is what they did. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But I feel like this is also an argument that's never going to go away.
Yeah.
I'm sure the church at the time, they're still like this, but in the Middle Ages and in early Renaissance, of course they were against that, because having people see different information, that's a threat to the church's power.
Yeah.
They're not in the they're not in the business of training their own enemies or their own competition. They don't need that.
And why have people thinking different things when, at the time religion was used in such a intense way of like, let's go to war with someone. Well, why would I want to go to war with them? Because God said to.
Right.
And they don't want a higher brain thinking person going,
right.
I don't know about that.
Any society needs maybe not a state religion, although the Roman Empire certainly did.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them, but that's how you get people to do what you want them to. It appeals to their natural anxiety and drives. It's like, if you're naturally anxious, you're gonna, and then someone tells you that you can go to hell. That's gonna affect you. If you're naturally kind of guilty, yeah, religion's gonna work for you.
So let's make sure I've covered everything. Did we talk about Rome?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did we talk about Arminius? That's
Yeah.
a pretty okay. Good. That's an important one. Okay.
Varus, you got him?
Yeah, I got him. Okay. Did we mention Hitler?
Can't be talking about German history at any time without mentioning history.
That's what I'm saying. All right, we're just
Anytime
going to
from
mention
980
Hitler.
on, you are contractually obligated to mention Adolf Hitler. You'd be talking about Bismarck. You'd be talking about Charlemagne. You're talking about Hitler.
Talk about Hitler.
Love Charlemagne, by the way. Definitely my favorite character in Pippin.
Well, Jeff King, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was a blast.
Thanks for having me on, Steve. And thanks other Steve for producing.
I hope you guys enjoy this episode of the Not Your Daddy's History Podcast. And let us know in the comments what you think we should study next. Thanks so much.